The brutal reality of Viking raids. When the horizon darkened, they never came with warnings. There were no proclamations, no blaring horns from far-off coasts, no skies that turned red before the storm. The arrival of the Vikings was often like a second sunset, dark, swift, consuming everything in its reach. And for those who lived in the quiet villages along the coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks became the drumbeat of fear. This is not the tale of horned helmets or glory-seeking heroes. This is not the saga of noble warriors with honor etched into their blades. No, this is the truth behind the myths, a whispered truth, one that often died with those who witnessed it. Because what the Viking raids left behind wasn't legend. It was silence. We begin in the late 8th century, on the eastern shores of what is now Northumbria. It was here, in 793 AD, that Lindisfarne, once a place of peace and prayer, became the symbol of an age of terror. Lindisfarne was a monastery, not a fortress. It was filled with monks, scrolls, relics, and the quiet murmurs of devotion. The monks believed in the sanctity of life, in the calm rhythm of routine, and in the protection of God, but the sea did not carry only blessings. One day, the waves brought ships long, sleek, and unlike anything they had ever seen. The monks saw them from afar, black sails and carved dragon heads slicing through the water like blades. They prayed. They hoped it was nothing. They were wrong. When the ships landed, the beach trembled. The air filled with foreign cries, language twisted by rage, by hunger, by cold northern winds. The Vikings stormed the monastery with axes that had seen more winters than some of the monks had years. No one was spared. Not because they were evil, but because they were surviving. This was not war. It was survival masked in brutality. The Vikings did not see sacred ground, they saw wealth. Gold chalices, jeweled crucifixes, manuscripts bound in leather and hope. To them, these were spoils, not sanctities. They took them. They burned what they couldn't carry. And those who resisted were reminded with iron and fire that the world was changing. Imagine being a villager in that time. You do not understand their words. You do not know where they come from. You only know that the sea has betrayed you. That what once brought fish and salt and news now brings fire and steel. Imagine hearing your neighbor scream through a window, and then nothing. Imagine hiding beneath floorboards, praying not to be found, knowing that even your silence could betray you if it cracked under fear. The reality was not theatrical. It was intimate. It was raw. It was mothers pressing their children against stone walls, hoping the night swallows their breath. It was farmers with pitchforks standing against swords. It was knowing that if your village was spared this time, it meant nothing for the next. And the Vikings? They were not demons. They were men shaped by cold earth, by scarcity, by a world that punished weakness. They were forged in frost and smoke. Back home, they had families. They sang songs. They believed in gods who demanded strength and conquest. To raid was to live. To hesitate was to die. What history calls raids were, in truth, brutal encounters between two ways of life, one built on isolation and prayer, the other on motion and force. It wasn't good against evil. It was survival meeting stillness. And the stillness always lost. Lindisfarne was just the beginning. As the years passed, more coasts would burn. More prayers would go unanswered. But something else would also begin: resilience. The realization that protection required unity. That silence was no longer safety. That the sea was a door, and anyone could walk through it. So when the horizon darkened again, and people no longer stood in doorways with hope. They built walls. They armed themselves. And they remembered Lindisfarne not as a tragedy, but as a warning written in smoke, because when the Vikings came, they didn't knock. They let the fire speak for them. Fire beneath the crosses, The raid on Lindisfarne had been a thunderclap, sudden, shocking, and unforgettable. But thunder doesn't strike just once. It echoes. It rolls across the land, whispering to the valleys and villages beyond that the sky is no longer a shelter. The news of the attack traveled slower than fear. Messengers ran, monks fled, and scrolls were hidden in haste. In the scriptoriums of monasteries across England and Ireland, trembling hands wrote of heathens from the north who spared neither woman nor child nor sacred house. The term Northman became more than geography, it became prophecy. And fire, once a symbol of warmth, became a signal of destruction. Monasteries had long been sanctuaries, not because they were defensible, but because they were spiritual fortresses. These were places where time passed differently, where men dedicated their lives to copying scripture and preserving the teachings of peace. They were never meant for battle, but now they were targets. Fat ones. Gold and silver flowed through these abbeys as gifts from kings and nobles' penance, tribute, or displays of devotion. But wealth has a scent, and across the North Sea, the Vikings had developed a keen nose for it. The monks' sacred chalices were not seen as vessels of grace, but as currency for survival. Ornate Bibles were not holy, they were kindling. And stone altars, built to outlast men, were now stained with reminders that permanence is only an illusion. In the years following Lindisfarne, the raids grew bolder. Places like Jarrow and Iona, once considered too remote to attract notice, were swept into the storm. Entire communities disappeared overnight. A bell that once called the faithful to prayer might now lie cracked in a pool of ash. Crosses that stood for centuries leaned in ruin, charred and defiled. And still, no one knew how to stop them. Why were the Vikings so successful? The answer lies not just in their strength, but in the stillness of their victims. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were fragmented, each a small island of power surrounded by uncertainty. Their kings ruled with swords but prayed with trembling hands. There was no single army, no unified strategy, only scattered villages, hopeful churches, and men who still believed that sanctity was a shield. But the Vikings knew better. Their ships were not just vessels, they were weapons. Built for speed, light enough to be carried across land, yet strong enough to cross oceans. They could appear where no enemy was expected, sail up rivers, glide into marshes, strike deep into the heart of kingdoms, and vanish before a response could even be mustered. It was like fighting a ghost with a sword made of clay. One night in 802, the island of Iona, a sacred place where kings had been buried and monks had worshipped for generations, was turned into a furnace. The Vikings arrived in silence, their ships slipping through the dawn mist like shadows. The monks heard nothing until the shouting began. By then, it was too late. Torches flared against timber beams. Scrolls works that had taken years to complete burned in seconds. Those who ran were hunted. Those who prayed were ignored. And those who hid were dragged into the light, where their lives were judged not by their holiness, but by their usefulness. Back home in Scandinavia, the reality was colder than the winters. Harsh climates, short growing seasons, political rivalries, and a burgeoning population drove many to seek fortune elsewhere. Raiding wasn't mindless destruction, it was strategy. It was economy, it was necessity. The brutality, though real, was often fueled more by hunger than hatred. Still, brutality it was. Captives were taken not just for ransom, but for slavery. Entire families were bound and thrown into ships like sacks of grain. The strong were sold in markets across the continent. The weak were discarded. Children were separated from parents, never to be reunited. And those who tried to resist were often met with the flat end of an axe, not for mercy, but because a quick blow was more convenient. Not all Vikings were raiders. Many were traders, settlers, craftsmen. But the ones who arrived in the dead of night, those who crept ashore with fire in one hand and steel in the other, became the face of a people. And once that face was seen, it could not be forgotten. Villages began to change. Priests stopped wearing ornaments. Monasteries buried their relics. Some churches moved inland, believing distance would protect them. Walls were built, watchtowers erected. But against ships that could appear from nowhere and vanish like mist, what protection could truly exist? There were those who believed the raids were divine punishment, that God had turned his face away, displeased with the pride of man. And so penance grew more severe: fasting, flagellation, public confession. But no matter how hard they prayed, the ships still came. The crosses still burned. And the silence that followed each raid grew heavier. For the Vikings, fire was not just a tool of destruction, it was communication. A monastery in flames was a message: we were here. You are not safe. The smoke that rose into the sky wasn't just ash, it was the memory of a place that once believed it was untouchable. Imagine standing on a cliffside, days after a raid, looking out at the sea. The horizon is calm now. Birds have returned. The wind smells of salt, not blood. But the ground beneath you still holds the warmth of the fire. The charred bones of a church still whisper of prayers unanswered. And deep in your chest, a question smolders: when will they come again? And they would, because for the Vikings, this was only the beginning. The coasts had been tested. Now the rivers awaited. The river that opened to blood. It was not the sea alone that trembled. Soon, the rivers, those silent silver roads slicing through the belly of kingdoms, would become veins of conquest. Where the coast had once been the only vulnerable edge, now every inlet, stream, and muddy bank whispered the same terrifying possibility: they can come from anywhere. Rivers had always been lifelines. They nourished crops, offered trade routes, fed the livestock and the soul alike. Small hamlets were built around them. Churches, mills, marketplaces, things of peace. But the Vikings, ever observant, saw something different. They saw doors. And in the early 9th century, they began to knock. It started in Francia, a vast kingdom ruled by the descendants of Charlemagne. The rivers of the Seine and the Loire, once gentle, now carried longships like venom in the bloodstream. These were not isolated attacks anymore. They were coordinated strikes, planned and executed with eerie precision. Entire fleets, 20, 30, sometimes 100 ships would slip up the water in silence, cutting through mist and shadow like ghosts in formation. Paris, once a city of reverence and learning, became a city of dread. The raid of 845 marked a turning point not just for Francia, but for all of Christendom. Ragnar Lothbrok, yes, the very one immortalized by sagas and songs, led a fleet of 120 ships up the Seine. The Parisians, used to being defended by distance, found themselves staring at the impossible. The river was full of dragons' longships adorned with snarling wooden heads, their crews shouting in a language that thundered against the cathedral walls. Churches bolted their doors, merchants fled. Nobles disappeared into cellars with their gold. But rivers do not obey gates, and ships do not fear prayers. Ragnar, and his men sacked the city with terrifying efficiency. They demanded tribute, Danegeld, as it would later be called, and left only after they were paid an enormous ransom. But this was not just about gold. This was about reputation. If even Paris could fall, then nowhere was sacred. The rivers had become traitors. And with that realization, fear changed shape. It no longer lived just in coastal towns. Now it slithered inland, hiding behind every bend in the water, every tree that leaned too low, every ripple that broke without reason. In England, it was the River Ouse. In Ireland, the River Shannon. In Scotland, the Clyde. The longships explored them all. What had once been boundaries became highways. And for the people who lived along them, life became a waiting game, one where the stakes were land, legacy, and life itself. Villagers began building lookouts, not just on hills, but on riverbanks. Small wooden towers manned by boys barely old enough to hold a blade. These watchmen were the first line of warning, though often the last to see the sunrise. I'd imagine being one of them. A foggy morning, birds silent. Then the sound soft at first, like oars in rhythm. Then louder, closer, the shadow of a sail against the mist. You ring the bell. You scream. You run. And behind you, the river opens its mouth and vomits forth the end of everything you knew. Some tried to fight. Many failed. There were stories, some real, some not, of entire towns that resisted and were annihilated. Of rivers that ran red for days. Of monasteries built near streams that, after one visit from the Vikings, were never rebuilt. The idea of a peaceful life near water became, for a time, absurd. And yet, the rivers were not to blame. They had always been neutral. It was the world that had changed. The Vikings did not invent violence, but they perfected its delivery. What made it worse was the unpredictability. A village might go untouched for years, and then one day everything is ash. Others, ravaged repeatedly, began to empty themselves. People fled inland, abandoning homes, churches, even cemeteries. And still, the longships came. The psychology of these raids was perhaps their most enduring cruelty. They eroded trust, not just in safety, but in stability. A child born near the river might grow to fear it more than wolves. A man might sleep with his boots on, always half dreaming of the oars that beat like war drums through his nightmares. And the irony? Even as the raids continued, the Vikings were also beginning to settle, to trade, to farm. Some longships came back not with fire, but with seeds. Towns were founded, names changed, cultures blended. But this was later. First came the blood dots of the rivers. Those silent mirrors of sky and land bore witness to both beauty and horror. They gave and they took, and though they never chose a side, their memory was painted with flame and cries. When you look at a river today, calm, slow, reflecting sunlight, you might not hear the oars or smell the smoke. But dig deep enough into the soil near its banks, and you might still find the bones. A buckle, a blade, a cross scorched black, because once, long ago, the river opened to blood. And the land has never quite forgotten the price of resistance. To resist is noble. But in the age of Viking raids, resistance was also costly, measured not just in blood, but in identity, in faith, in the vanishing of entire ways of life. The price of standing one's ground was often the total erasure of that ground. And yet many still tried. By the mid-9th century, across the kingdoms of England, Ireland and Francia, a shift was taking place. No longer content to merely pray or pay for peace, some leaders began to fortify, to organize, to fight. But bravery does not always equal victory, especially when the enemy does not play by the same rules. The kingdom of Northumbria was among the first to test the cost of defiance. In 866, the Vikings returned not as raiders, but as conquerors. They came with the great heathen army, a coalition of warbands larger and more disciplined than ever before. Their goal was not a monastery or a marketplace. It was the kingdom itself, York, a bustling city filled with markets, minsters, and cobbled streets, became the epicenter. King El of Northumbria, known for his harsh rule and prideful heart, marshaled his forces to face the invaders. And for a moment, it seemed possible. Spears lined the gates. Prayers filled the air. Citizens held their breath, but the Vikings didn't storm the city. Not at first. They waited. They watched. And when infighting broke out between El and a rival claimant to the throne, Osbert, the invaders struck. The two kings, forced into an uneasy alliance, fought side by side against the northern tide. They failed. The Chronicles speak in vague terms. They say El was captured, that he was subjected to the Blood Eagle, a grisly execution. wherein the ribs are spread like wings and the lungs pulled out while the victim still breathes. Some modern historians debate its reality, but in the minds of those who heard the tale then, it didn't matter. The point was made: resist, and you will be remembered only in screams. The fall of York sent ripples through the land. Other kingdoms watched, weighing their chances. Some chose tribute, others evacuation. A few still clung to steel and scripture. In Wessex, King Alfred, later called the Great, understood both the cost and necessity of resistance. He reorganized his army, established fortified towns called burhs, and even developed a navy to combat the invaders at sea. He didn't just fight the Vikings, he adapted to them. And while many battles were lost, Alfred's legacy was forged not in a single moment, but in sustained resilience. But for every Alfred, there were dozens of forgotten figures. Local leaders who raised militias from farmers and blacksmiths. Monks who traded quills for boughs. Mothers who hid their children beneath floorboards, while flames chewed through thatched roofs above. They resisted not because they thought they would win, but because surrender was unthinkable. And still, the price was paid. In Ireland, the monastic centers of Armagh and Clonmacnoise were devastated. Not just looted, but systematically broken. Crosses smashed, altars desecrated. The quiet sanctity of centuries undone in a single afternoon. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who surrendered were sometimes cut down anyway. There were heroes, yes. Stories of villages that repelled longships with boiling pitch, or abbots who held bridges with staffs and fire. But those tales often ended in elegies, not celebrations. For the Vikings, resistance was expected, respected even. A warrior who fought back was worthy of a clean death. One who begged was often shown less mercy. And so, paradoxically, resistance became both a death sentence and a form of dignity. To die with a blade in your hand was to keep some control over how you left this world. But for those who survived, the scars were generational. Sons buried fathers. Daughters fled homes turned to ash. Languages changed. Cultures bent. And memories, those silent witnesses, faded with each new storm. Some communities rebuilt, others never did. Fields once fertile were left fallow. Wells poisoned. And the rivers, always the rivers, continued to carry both tears and fire. Downstream. There's something deeply human in the need to stand against what overwhelms us. A refusal to be erased. But history is not always kind to those who try. In the age of Viking raids, resistance was not just a matter of steel. It was a form of mourning. A way to say, we were here. We mattered. Even if no one remembers our names. And so they resisted. And so they were erased. But in the silence that followed, their courage echoed louder than the flames ever did. The captives and the coin. In the echo of burning monasteries and sacked villages, a quieter horror settled over the survivors. Not fire, not steel, but chains. It was not always death that awaited those left standing. Often, it was captivity. And for many, that was a fate more uncertain, more terrifying. The Viking raids were not only acts of war. They were also engines of economy. Gold and silver were welcome. But human beings? They were priceless. In every raid, especially inland or in wealthier communities, captives were gathered like crops. Men strong enough to row or build. Women young enough to bear children. Children small enough to be molded or sold. Slavery, long a part of the ancient world, found renewed vigor in the age of the Norse. From Lindisfarne to Dublin, captives were bound in ropes or chains and marched to waiting longships. The silence of the aftermath was often broken by the soft clinking of metal and the muffled cries of the taken. Those who resisted were beaten. Those who begged were ignored. And those who prayed were left wondering if their God could still hear them across the sea. Dublin, in particular, became a notorious hub. Established by the Vikings as a base of operations, it quickly evolved into one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. Here, captives were weighed, priced, and traded like goods, examined not for their souls, but for their teeth, their backs, their potential yield. Some were ransomed. If a village or family had coin or political value, they could negotiate. Letters were sent, messages carved on stone or bark. But many were not so lucky. Most were sold far from their homeland, their names forgotten, their lineage severed. Slavery in the Viking world was complex. Some captives were absorbed into Norse households as servants or concubines. Others were treated brutally, worked until death, or sacrificed in rituals lost to time. And a few, very few, eventually gained freedom, adopting Norse customs and even rising in status. But these were exceptions carved out of extreme survival. Imagine the journey. You wake to fire. You fight or flee. You're captured. The land you knew fades into mist as you're forced aboard a ship whose language you don't speak. You're rowed for days. No one explains. No one comforts. The sun sets and rises, but time loses meaning. Then, you arrive in a place where your name is meaningless, where your prayers are foreign, where you are nothing but property. The psychological toll was immense. Many captives, especially the young, lost their sense of self entirely. Some tried to keep memories alive by whispering songs in the dark. Others clung to fragments, a lock of hair, a ribbon, a word in their mother tongue. But as the years passed, even those remnants faded. Coin, of course, flowed. A strong, young captive could fetch enough silver to feed a Norse household for a year. A noble woman, if kept, might be used to forge alliances or simply held as a trophy. And while some Vikings saw this as pragmatic, others reveled in the power it gave them. They could erase entire bloodlines with a single raid and profit from the erasure. The church decried the practice. But even Christian kingdoms trafficked in slaves, sometimes buying back their own people or purchasing foreign captives for labor. Hypocrisy, like suffering, knew no borders. There are records, faint and fragmentary, of some captives who eventually returned home. A monk who escaped and wrote of his time in a Norse household. A woman who raised half-Norse children and sang lullabies in a language they never understood. But most never returned. Their stories ended far from where they began, their names lost to fire and tide. And yet, their shadows remain in the stone foundations of old Norse settlements, in the bloodlines that cross unexpected borders, in the silent spaces between saga and truth. The raids were brutal, yes, but it was the taking, the quiet theft of lives, futures, and histories that left a deeper wound. Not every death is loud, and not every survivor is free. As we look back through the haze of centuries, we often remember the swords, the sails, the flame. But remember this too: there were captives, and there was coin, and in between them, the weight of human sorrow, too heavy for any ledger to hold. The women who were taken and the legacies they carried. They were the daughters of priests, the wives of fishermen, the mothers of children who would never find them again. And when the longships came, it was often their stories that vanished first. Much has been said about the weapons, the fire, the plunder. But within the smoke, within the silence after the screams, there were women taken, not for ransom, not for labor, but for possession. Their names are lost to time, but their shadows remain carried in whispered sagas, in the fractured bloodlines of kingdoms and clans. For the Vikings, women were both prize and power. In the eyes of many Norsemen, to take a woman was to take the future of a people. She could be kept as a concubine, gifted to a warrior, or traded like coin. Her body became a symbol of conquest, not just over land, but over lineage. Some were paraded through villages as trophies. Others were forced into quiet servitude, cooking, weaving, bearing children for a language they never chose. And for many, the worst wound was not the violence, but the silence that followed it. the erasure of who they had been. The impossibility of returning. In places like Ireland and the north of England, the legacy of these women can still be traced. Genetic studies hint at sudden surges of Scandinavian lineage. Surnames shift, words from Norse tongues creep into lullabies. And still, the stories remain mostly untold. There are rare mentions in the saga's half-glimpsed women who shaped kings and built homes. But most accounts were written by men, for men, and about men. The pain of the women was often wrapped in poetry or forgotten entirely, but we can imagine a young woman hiding beneath floorboards, clutching her sister's hand as the thatch roof crackles above. A mother shielding her child as strangers kick down the chapel door. A wife torn from her husband in the night, her last sight of him being the light of a burning village reflected in his eyes, and then darkness. Longships that reeked of sea and sweat. Foreign voices, cold hands, and a future that no longer belonged to her. Some resisted. A few even killed their captors. Their names became legend, whispered in corners of the old world. But most had to survive, quietly, enduring, adapting, burying the memory deep enough to keep breathing. And yet, within their stolen lives, they still carried something sacred. Memory, language, rituals. Some passed them to their children. Others folded them into the stitching of clothes, into the rhythm of prayers mouthed in secret. They carried songs and grief, and a stubborn flicker of identity that refused to die. In Norse society, women both native and captive were paradoxes. Revered as shield maidens in legend, but often silenced in reality. A free Norse woman could own land, divorce her husband, even wield power. A captive, however, had none of that. She was the edge of the sword's shadow, the proof that someone had lost, but still, they endured. There are grave sites in Scandinavia with foreign jewelry buried beneath Norse soil. There are bones that show signs of childbirth beside weapons that tell of raids. And in between, there is the unspoken truth that many Viking children grew up hearing bedtime stories in two languages, one harsh, one soft, one that spoke of war, and one that remembered home. We cannot rewrite their stories, but we can remember them, not as spoils, not as symbols, but as women who were taken, who were silenced, and who still found a way to echo. The fire that touched. The sacred. There are places that feel untouchable, fortresses of faith, islands of silence, stone sanctuaries built not for war, but for wonder. In the early medieval world, monasteries were such places. Built far from cities, nestled on windswept cliffs or hidden among hills. They were meant to be closer to God than to the violence of men. But even the sacred burned from the first attack. On Lindisfarne in 793, it became clear the Vikings did not respect the same boundaries. Where Christian warriors might hesitate at a church's threshold, the Norse saw only opportunity. They saw gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, silver crosses, more treasure than any single village could ever offer. And so, the fire came to the sacred. Imagine the scene. A small monastery on a misty island. Bells ring for matins. Monks rise. In silence, moving in rhythm, their thoughts still with the Psalms. A door creaks open. Not the wind, not the bell ringer. Boots wet and foreign step through the nave. And before the prayer can leave a throat, it is silenced with steel. Accounts from these attacks are scarce, but haunting. Monks described heathens with axes and torches, breaking into the sanctum, tearing down icons, laughing as they threw scripture into the sea. Some tried to fight, others begged. Some simply closed their eyes and waited for it to end. They were not warriors. They were scribes, gardeners, keepers of knowledge. The monasteries of Iona, Jarrow, and Glendalough weren't just places of worship. They were centers of learning. Within their walls were illuminated manuscripts, philosophical treatises, and medical texts copied carefully by hand across generations. When the Vikings set fire to their halls, they didn't just burn buildings. They burned memory, civilization. And yet, they did not always destroy. Sometimes they spared the books, recognizing their beauty. Other times they took the monks captive, believing their god might fetch a price or a curse. There are even stories of Vikings keeping Christian relics, not out of reverence but superstition, fearing they might anger unseen powers. The fire that touched the sacred was more than literal. It signaled a shift in the world, a realization that no place was truly safe, that even the most secluded abbey could be reduced to ash, that the divine too could bleed. This fear spread faster than the raids themselves. In Francia, noble families fortified churches. In England, stone replaced timber. And across Christendom, a new prayer began to echo, a furor Normanorum Libera. Nos Domini. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. But the fury kept coming. Not every monastery was destroyed. Some were rebuilt. Others were spared by chance or by tribute. But the trauma remained. The rhythm of monastic life, the ringing of bells, the turning of pages, the planting of herbs was now punctuated by watchmen and sword drills. The silence was forever changed. And yet, within the ashes, something remarkable happened. A deeper resilience. Some monks continued to copy texts in secret. Others hid relics in caves. Some wrote of the raids in chilling detail, not for vengeance, but for memory. Because the sacred, once touched by fire, does not disappear. It transforms. Psalms still echoed. The bells still rang. And though the walls were scarred, they stood, because even fire must end. But faith, when tempered by grief, endures in ways no sword can sever. The long silence of the survivors, when the flames dimmed, when the long ships vanished beyond the mist, when the last scream folded into memory, what remained was silence. Not peace, silence. A quiet that stretched over ruins, over rivers red with reflection, over the faces of those who had not died, but had lost something they could not name. Survivors, left to rebuild homes with shaking hands and carry stories that no one truly wanted to hear. In the wake of Viking raids, the survivors were not celebrated heroes. They were reminders of failure, of vulnerability, of the gods gone silent. And so many did not speak. Children who saw their fathers killed would never speak of the day again. Women who were taken and escaped would bury their memories deep beneath layers of daily labor. Monks who had lost entire libraries would light candles for names no longer in any book. This silence was not only personal, it became communal. Whole villages would change the way they built, facing their doors differently, planting hedges higher, digging secret holes in the earth to hide their most precious things. The architecture of fear took shape not in castles, but in cottages. Not in strategy, but in superstition. And still, life continued. The cows had to be milked, the children fed, the crops planted. And though nothing was as it had been, people learned to pretend. The human spirit, in all its stubbornness, chose rhythm over despair. Even if the rhythm was broken, some sang different songs. Some lit new fires. Some joined local militias, sharpening blades they hoped never to use. And some fled. Entire families, moving inland, further from the coast, hoping distance would guard them better than prayer had. Others turned inward. Grief turned to guilt. Why did I survive? Why not them? Shame took root, especially among men who had hidden, women who had not fought, elders who had begged. But none of it was weakness. It was humanity, yet no one spoke of it. And so the silence grew. There were those who broke it. Old men who told stories by the fire with too much wine. Widows who whispered to daughters late at night. Scribes who recorded memories in the margins of Bibles. But even then, the stories came wrapped in metaphor, softened by time, because pain that raw cannot be passed on directly. It must be carried gently, or it will cut again. And so it seeped into lullabies, into superstition, into the way a mother checked the horizon before sending her child to fetch water, into the way a village grew silent when the tide was too high, or the gulls flew inland. The survivors left no great monuments, no epics, only subtle shifts in behavior. And the ache behind their eyes. We often study the conquerors, the swords, the strategy, the blood. But to understand the full truth of history, we must also sit with the ones who stayed, the ones who did not die, the ones who, in surviving, carried the heaviest burden of all. The burden of remembering. The truth behind the myths. When we speak of Vikings today, we speak through the haze of myth, horned helmets that never existed, brave warriors who drank from skulls, fierce gods with thunder in their fists. But behind the legends, beneath the carvings, far from the fireside tales, there's another truth, one harder to hold, one many would rather forget. The Vikings, in their rawest form, were not noble savages or romantic rogues. They were men shaped by cold seas, harsh winters, and the logic of survival. To them, a raid was not evil, it was expected. A right, a way to gain wealth, fame, favor with the gods. In their minds, the world was not divided into good and evil, only strong and weak. And to be weak was to die. Their mythology, beautiful and brutal, reflected this. A world where even gods could bleed, where valor was found not in kindness, but in courage, where the afterlife promised battle, not rest. In such a world, mercy was not a virtue. It was a risk, and yet they were not monsters. They laughed, loved, sang, they raised families, honored ancestors, crafted poetry that could break your heart with a single line. They made ships that danced with the sea. And in every village they raided, they left not only blood, but also language, art, and ideas. This is the complexity we avoid when we reduce them to caricatures. Yes, they burned monasteries, but they also converted to Christianity within generations. Yes, they took slaves, but they also married locals, founded kingdoms, and birthed cultures that still breathe in today's Europe. The truth is not comfortable. The truth is that men can be both cruel and cultured. That a hand which writes poetry can also wield a sword. That empires are often born from ash, and that history is written not by the just, but by the ones who survive. And so we must tread carefully. To glorify the Vikings without their victims is to erase the screams that never made it into the sagas. To demonize them without understanding is to repeat the very cycle of fear they once thrived upon. True history whispers. It does not shout. It sits with contradictions. It holds the mirror up not to the past but to us. Why are we drawn to these men? What do they awaken in us? The thirst for adventure? The yearning for power? The belief that somehow we too could carve our name into the world by force? Or is it guilt? A deep recognition that some part of our inheritance, our modern borders, our languages, our very identities was built atop someone else's loss? To learn about the Vikings is not just to study them. It is to study ourselves. And in that mirror, we may see both the raider and the village, both the fire and the silence. Echoes in the fjords. Time softens even the sharpest scars. The blood washes away. The villages rebuild. The names of the fallen fade like ink in rain, but echoes remain. In the fjords of Norway, where the mountains meet the sea, and the wind carries stories older than memory, there is still something in the air. A tension, a silence between gusts, a whisper that does not belong to the century. Not quite. Stand alone on the cliffs of Lofoten, and you may feel it. That strange sensation that the sea knows more than it tells. That beneath the waves, voices still stir. They are not screams, not anymore. They are the weight of what happened, of what was taken, of what could never be returned. These are the echoes of the Viking raids, not in sound, but in spirit. Every time someone speaks Old Norse, or walks the stones of York, or lights a candle in a church rebuilt after a raid, the echo stirs. Every time a child asks why some words in their language feel foreign, why their surname has roots across the sea, the echo answers quietly but surely. History, after all, never disappears. It embeds itself in everything. In rivers, in songs, in fears passed from parent to child without explanation. It's in the way coastal towns still glance toward the horizon when the mist rolls in. It's in the way stories are told with a pause, a breath, a wait. The Viking Age ended centuries ago, but the age of remembering never does. For every saga sung in longhouses there was a silence kept in ruins. For every warrior honored in stone, there was a farmer buried without a name. We honor both now. We must. Because the brutal reality of Viking raids is not just a history of what was done, but of what remains. In fjords, in families, in the aching beauty of a world that still, somehow, survived. So let the wind whisper. Let it carry the echoes to the next generation. Not for fear, but for truth. Because to truly remember is to listen.